Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats as our program is about to begin. Please note, the views expressed are those of the individual speakers and do not represent the views of the National Urban League. As a reminder, please silence your phones.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I want to say how excited we are that all of you all have come out this morning, have traveled from far and near to be a part of not only today, but the next 3 days for the State of Black America release and the 16th Legislative Policy Conference. Let me begin by welcoming all of our Urban League local leaders, our affiliate CEOs, guilders, young professionals, and board chairs and board members who are here. If we would give them a warm round of applause. I want to thank all of you colleagues for being with us this morning. I also want to thank all of our friends, guests, partners, and others who have joined us and who will join us over the next 3 days as we talk about some of the pertinent issues that face the nation, that face Black America, and that face all of our local communities. And I also want to thank and give my appreciation to Team NUL. That's the staff team that does all of the hard work to put all of these events together. If you would give them a warm round of applause. "16 years ago, we came to this National Press Club for the first Legislative Policy Conference and introduced at that time the concept of elevating the voice around the state of Black America, created in 1976 by my predecessor, Vernon Jordan. And while I thank you for being with us today for the 2019 edition of the State of Black America, I want to note that we're in our 44th year of reporting to the nation the conditions, economic, social, and otherwise, that face this nation's African American communities. Our theme for this year, Getting to Equal, United, Not Divided, is also the theme of the 2019 State of Black America report, which examines the state of the black vote. Now, attacks on black voting rights have escalated in the current era. Make no mistake about it, attacks on voting rights and on democracy have escalated to a level not seen since the 1960s and threaten to move this great nation further from the concept of one person, one vote. Therefore, it is necessary that the National Urban League document this crisis in this year's State of Black America report, which is the nation's most highly anticipated and widely respected annual examination of the social and economic status of African Americans. We found this challenge when it comes to democracy and voting so urgent that we have foregone the calculation of the Equality Index, our numerical tool for comparing indicators of equity. That does not mean that that Equality Index is gone for good. It simply means that this year we felt the need to dive deep, to dig deep, to go broad on the challenges facing democracy and the African American vote. And we'll present the Equality Index once again next year in the 2020 version of the State of Black America. Now, we're very proud of the dynamic group of thought leaders and experts that have assembled to contribute to this report. We have some here today, and let me just acknowledge a few contributors. Please stand so that we may thank you. We collaborated, and let me just ask any contributor to the report who's with us today, if you would please stand. We want to recognize you. Thank you, Reverend Yearwood, Melanie Campbell, Ruth Silas Lee, Jerry Green, Tony Wiley, and there are many, many others. And I'd say if you have something you want to contribute, the State of Black America is now a 365-day-a-year report. Because we are online, we're always adding to the content, to the conversation, to the discussion. Because we are on social media, we're going to continue to discuss, to deliberate, and to debate the facts, the figures, the issues, and the findings. I also want to give a very special thanks this year for our two research partners. First, the Brennan Center for Justice contributed greatly to the report. The maps you see in the executive summary are the hard work of the Brennan Center for Justice. Let's give them a round of applause. And the German Marshall Fund. The German Marshall Fund shared their research on voter suppression and foreign interference. This morning's event is made possible by the strong support of our partners AT&T and Geico. Let's thank both of them for their hard work, and you will hear from their representatives in a minute. And I also want to thank our editorial director, Shufi Pangan, Dr. Silas Lee, our executive editor, and our marketing and communications team, Rhonda Spears, Bell, Tara Thomas, and Tess Kandori, who also worked very hard on the report. Let's give them a warm round of applause. Without AT&T, who among other ventures have been involved in our efforts to spread the word about the State of Black America, I'm very proud that here to represent AT&T is Xavier Williams. Xavier is no stranger to us. He's been with us at the State of Black America in the past. He is the president of Public Sector and Wholesale Solutions with AT&T. Please greet Xavier Williams.
So good morning, everyone. As Mark said, my name is Xavier Williams, and I am the president of AT&T's Public Sector business. It's an honor to be here with you today. On behalf of AT&T, I'm grateful to join our friends, the National Urban League, and all of you here at the National Press Club for this timely conversation. In particular, National Urban League President Mark Morial deserves our gratitude for his tireless devotion to the advancement of the Black community, his vision for a just future, and his valued friendship. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mark for a long time. Years ago, I was working in Pittsburgh and was running a sales center up there for AT&T, and I was very fortunate to serve on the local Urban League board. I don't know if Esther Bush is here, but there's my mother right there. How you doing, Esther? Point of personal privilege, I apologize. We were very fortunate to host a national conference, and as it turned out, it was Mark's debut as the Urban League leader. Ever since that time, I've been witness to the extraordinary success that Mark has led the National Urban League. His tireless leadership, I don't even know how to say all this, but being the driving force for the league, the continued growth, the success of the organization, and as witnessed by the State of Black America, all the work that y'all do day in and day out. Based on last year's State of Black America report, I thought it would be take a little time to talk about what AT&T has done as a result of what was shared last year. Last year's report concluded that less than 5% of employees at tech and social media companies were Black. At AT&T, we took that challenge seriously and made a very clear and forceful commitment to do better. We continue to invest in the Black community as we've always done, creating jobs and opportunity directly for Black individuals. But the report itself made us look in the mirror and say we need to do better. We focused our efforts on building the Black talent pipeline even more to ensure our workforce reflects the tens of millions of customers we serve day in and day out. I'm proud to report our Black employee workforce makes up 18.5% of our US-based workforce, but we could do better. We started doing a lot more in terms of thinking about how we could create jobs in the Black community. Last year, we launched an initiative that we call AT&T Believes across the United States. Let me give you an example of one of the things that we did, and I'm going to pick on Chicago. We have a program called AT&T Believes Chicago. The purpose of this program is to improve lives and lift its most distressed neighborhoods. To that end, by promoting opportunity through hiring, education, and training, we've created 500 new call center jobs there. Most of these are filled with members of the Black community from across the 19 most distressed neighborhoods that are being affected by gun violence day in and day out. What we found is simply give people an opportunity, give them a job, and they'll do something good with their lives. We've also looked at other programs, specifically something that Tanya Lombard has embarked upon. It's called the Humanity of Connections. It is an opportunity for us to celebrate community leaders, celebrate all the good things such as the Urban League is doing in the community, and really propel the Black experience. Another thing that we have done, and just give me one more second, is, and this is a real important one for us, we've committed to spend $3 billion with Black-owned companies by 2020. Now, that being said, we need everyone in here's help finding and identifying these companies and making sure that it is in the area of technical development. Last and not least, that I want to point out, and Mark, I want to thank you for your leadership here. Technology is changing day in and day out. One of the areas that creates a huge opportunity for everyone is this new technology called 5G. Fifth generation of wireless technology, and everyone in here will be impacted by it. AT&T, we're on the vanguard of it. We have mobile 5G service in 19 cities, and we'll be growing to 22 by the end of this year, and we anticipate having the nation covered within the next 18 months. That's why we're partnering with the National Urban League and also the National Action Network to launch 2 opportunity labs. These labs will bring together local leaders from government, business, nonprofit, and academia to help local community residents gain the skills and technology training they need to launch successful careers in this area. We look forward to this year's State of Black America report with challenges we have to focus on going into 2020. And I just want to thank the National Urban League, Mark, your leadership, and the Black community for all that you do. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark.
Excellent words by Xavier, and I might add, in addition to thanking Xavier, I want to thank Tanya Lombard, Yvette Pugh, both team members at AT&T who are present today for their partnership and work, as well as to lift up our National Urban League trustee, Charlene Lake, who is not here, who's an executive with AT&T, and the big man at AT&T, Randall Stevenson, who is as forward a thinking CEO that I have met. His personal commitment, his understanding of not only technology but diversity and the intersectionality of those certainly makes him stand out. So let's give Xavier and the AT&T team another round of applause. Thank you for your partnership and for your leadership. And we're now extremely grateful to our partners at Geico. And here to represent Geico is National Urban League trustee Renthia Ross, Vice President for Public Affairs. Renthia.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. We all know 15 minutes can save you 15% or more in your car insurance. So, and that little gecko, he's great, isn't he? Yeah, I love him. Geico's hometown, Washington, D.C. We're the #1 property casualty company in Washington, D.C. We're the #2 property casualty company in America and rising. With over 17 million policyholders, this 16 years of the State of Black America report, we've been here for all those 16 years. I've been a member of the National Urban League for 25 years. 25 years of being a part of the National Urban League is a sweet spot for me because I'm a child of the National Urban League. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia in 1955. Don't count it. Stop. And I got scholarships to go to school from the National Urban League who were writing the scholarships for the, what's it called? Mine is a terrible thing to waste. UNC, yeah, they gave me my scholarship to go to Fisk University. And that scholarship led me to Indiana University, where I got a law degree, was a civil rights attorney for the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and then the greatest job in the world opened up for me to come to Geico so that I could actually do something with that background and that experience and lend it to the National Urban League on their Board of Trustees. So the state of Black America is very important to me as an African-American woman, as a child of the Civil Rights Movement, and I am so blessed that my company, Geico, has, for at least the 25 years that I've been here, and before I got here, had someone on the board of the Urban League in Washington, D.C., our hometown. I remember meeting Maudine Cooper at the cusp of my relationship with the Urban League here in Washington, D.C., and I took my CEO over, he took me over and said, you need to meet Maudine Cooper. That's our relationship, and that's something I'm very proud of. So our nexus with this organization and what it's done and what it's about to do today in releasing what's happening in America is so very important. It's important because people need to know the numbers. They need to know the past, they need to know the present, they need to know how to get to the future. And that's what the Urban League has been doing for so many years with its initial, I couldn't say allowance, but the first time someone spoke from the Lincoln Memorial, it was someone from the National Urban League that made that happen. What was that gentleman's name? Whitney Young. Whitney Young, yeah. So Whitney Young made it possible for us all to be here today to talk about what needs to happen, where are we now, where are we going, what needs to happen in the uniting of America rather than the dividing of America. And I so love that focus that we have, because too many people think that if you give somebody something, you got to take it away from somebody else. Too many people believe that in order to get somewhere, you have to press somebody down, and that's not what's happening right now. I'm a member of the Economic Club, and I heard Steve Ballmer, I think his name is, who bought the Clippers for $3 billion, and everybody's upset about that, especially the owners, and I don't blame them. That was a high price for the Clippers. But in any event, what I want to say is that he has a new company now. He is looking at the numbers, like most. He's a frustrated CEO. You know what I mean? And he says there are numbers out there, and the country's not being run like a CEO ought to run the country. He ought to know, right? And he started Microsoft, and he knows about money and about organization and about leadership and all of those things. He knows the price of things. And one of the things that he said in his report, which I'm sure will be echoed in our report, I say our because I'm a trustee, what will be echoed in our report is that you can't keep spinning yourself out of a hole. You've got to have income, and that income has to come from somewhere. It's coming from us, and then we have to make decisions about how to spend that money, and spending it on people, and spending it on technology, and spending it on the future is very important. I have been blessed by being in a room for the last 25 years with the titans of business. A guy named Warren Buffett. He owns Geico. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway. And one thing he has taught me over the years is that you have to manage by the numbers. And this country has to be managed by the numbers. And our numbers today will show you that the management of us going forward requires equality and unity. Thank you very much, Mark.
I want to thank Rinthia for all of her work, and in mentioning Maudine Cooper, I certainly want to acknowledge George Lambert, the president of the Greater Metropolitan Washington Urban League, our host affiliate for these events, and thank Rinthia and Xavier. It's great to work with corporate partners and businesses who are committed to diversity and inclusion, and their commitment is an example of corporate citizenship and social responsibility, and we should not be afraid to use those terms. There should be cooperation among business, government, private enterprises, and community-based movements like the Urban League movement. I certainly want to give all of our corporate partners, particularly once again Geico and AT&T, a warm, warm applause. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get to the heart of the matter, the meat of the report. You ready? Over the last 10 years, the right to vote for African Americans has been under assault. Pernicious, intentional, deliberate, orchestrated, diabolical, and clever. And there's been no period since the 1965 Voting Rights Act has passed that these efforts have been so sustained. I like to think the attack is coming from three main fronts, or what I like to call the terrible trio. The first member of the trio is the United States Supreme Court, which in 2013, the year of the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, in a poorly reasoned, in an inexplicable decision that I predict will go down like Dred and Plessy as low moments in the history of American jurisprudence, knocked out an important provision of the Voting Rights Act. That provision required Southern states to gain Justice Department approval before they change their voting laws. What has happened since that provision has been disabled? No less than 40 states have been on a tear to hastily introduce and seek to pass a wide range of laws. 1, voter ID laws. 2, poll closing. 3, voter purging. 4, handcuffing community-based organizations like the League of Women Voters or the National Urban League or any community-based organization from registering people to vote. The first member of this terrible trio is the United States Supreme Court. The second member of this terrible trio are these state legislatures all across America. These state legislatures which have sought, most recently the state legislature in the state of Tennessee, seeking to make it more difficult for people to vote by adding artificial restrictions based on flimsy and phony reasoning that have no other intent whatsoever but to stop people from voting and to stop black people from voting. In no less than 3 cases, 3 federal court cases, states have been found to have intentionally discriminated in passing these laws. The second member of the trio are state legislatures all across America. The third member of this terrible trio is the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation and its internet research agency called the IRA. The IRA and the Russian Federation, and much has been written, and much has been in the public domain and at the public square about the role of Russian interference in the 2016 election. But what has not been clearly articulated is that the Russians had an intent. They had multiple intents. One of the driving intents was to suppress the African American vote. And our report, thanks to the research of the German Marshall Fund, is going to take the covers off of that intent, because we need to understand how pervasive, pernicious, and widespread it was. This is all occurring at a time in American history when the voting power of people of color is reaching an all-time high. In 2020, voters of color are projected to represent more than 1/3 of the American electorate, up from less than 1/4 of the 2000 electorate. Since 2010, 25 states representing more than half of the voters in the country and representing a substantial majority of African American voters have enacted new restrictions. As I mentioned, strict voter ID laws, hurdles to registration, cuts to early voting, barriers to restoring voting rights for people with criminal convictions. These legislatures are the enemies of democracy. This nation has fought wars to restore democracy abroad. How can we, in 2019, not raise our voices to the highest pitch while democracy and the right to participate is under attack right here in the United States of America? We have no voice on education policy without the right to vote. We have no voice on jobs and economic policy without the right to vote. We have no voice on tax policy or foreign policy or housing policy without the right to vote. These laws may be subtle on their face about their motivation, but let me tell you what a political advisor to Florida legislators said. He said, and I quote, "The cutting out of the Sunday before Election Day was one of their targets only because that's a big day when the black churches organize themselves." The court that struck down North Carolina's monster voter suppression law said it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. The 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder opened the floodgates for racially motivated voter suppression laws, releasing states and jurisdictions with a long history of discrimination from having these laws approved by the Justice Department. Chief Justice John Roberts reasoned that because preclearance had achieved its goal of eliminating racial disparity in voting rates, it was no longer needed. Respectfully, Mr. Chief Justice, where do you live? Respectfully, Mr. Chief Justice, we invite you to visit Georgia and to visit Florida and visit the 40 states across America where racially motivating efforts are alive and unfortunately well in America. But we do agree with Justice RBG, that's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, y'all, who wrote in her dissent, throwing out preclearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Shelby was just one of several blows against democracy that this Supreme Court has struck in recent years. It struck down campaigns, finance reform laws, and Citizens United, and unleashed the unbridled financial power of super PACs, where wealthy individuals could pour unlimited money into the American political process. And most recently, in Husted versus the A. Philip Randolph Institute, an Ohio case, the court upheld the right of states to use aggressive purges to remove voters from the registration rolls, a process that disproportionately affects communities of color. Now, the exploitation of racial division was the biggest element of Russian interference in the 16 and 18 elections. These efforts were aimed at African Americans, and they were exploitive, using the trust in authentic black media to recruit assets who were unaware of the role they played in sharing propaganda. The Russians posted more than 1,000 videos on YouTube and shared across all social media platforms. Hundreds of millions of Twitter and Instagram users were reached, and thousands of fake accounts were used to manipulate black voters and dissuade them from voting. Vote from home is just one example. Take a look at this. The Russians, seeking to manipulate African American voters, appeal to African American voters on the internet to quote unquote vote from home by texting to a particular number, something that is not allowed in any state and would have the effect of tricking people into believing that they had voted when they in fact cast no vote. Manipulative social media posts that were distributed by Russian trolls. If they couldn't convince people not to vote, they were going to make sure as many of our votes as possible would not be counted. That's just a general overview of the issues we examine in this year's State of Black America. I might add that the Russians created people like Louisa Haynes. Louisa Haynes was a Russian troll. She was a Black Lives Matter activist. She had the handle Woke Louisa. Louisa was very active in social media, telling African Americans, don't vote. All politicians are sellouts. All Democrats are sellouts. And by the way, if you do vote, don't vote for the Democratic candidate. Ladies and gentlemen, this effort by the Russians to manipulate and use social media is a new dimension in our fight for democracy in America. It's a new element of voter suppression. And it is something that I am hopeful that the Congress of the United States, the Senate of the United States, and all of you will elevate In order to stop it, we need to be transparent about it. And we hold this up today. So I'd like to invite to the stage at this time Wendy Weiser, Director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center, one of our partners in this report, who will share further insights into voter suppression efforts at the state level. Thank you, Wendy. Please greet Wendy.
Thank you to Mark and the National Urban League and all today's sponsored. The Brennan Center is honored to partner with the National Urban League on this critical report. No set of issues is more important to the future of our democracy and our communities. We at the Brennan Center track and study legislation, litigation, and other actions affecting voting nationwide. We both fight for voting rights and we do the numbers. And based on that, I want to make a few observations about the current moment. First, this past election was marred by some of the most brazen, intense, and widespread voter suppression we've seen in decades. As Mark said, voters in 25 states, half the country, faced an accumulation of new laws making it harder to vote than it was a decade ago. And it wasn't only formal laws that tripped up voters. States like Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida purged between 7 and 11% of the names on their voter rolls before that election. Nationally, voter purge rates grew substantially over the past decade, and much of that increase came in states that were previously covered under the Voting Rights Act because of their history of discrimination in voting. Second, efforts to restrict voting access are continuing strenuously across the country. For example, our recent roundup of voting legislation shows a spike in efforts to restrict the ability of civic groups to help people register to vote or vote. In Tennessee, for example, after a local group registered 90,000 African American voters last year, the state just passed a law that would curtail voter registration drives there. African Americans are twice as likely as Caucasian voters to register through drives. Even more alarming, the Florida legislature just passed a bill, which is now sitting on the governor's desk, not yet signed, that could roll back voting rights for hundreds of thousands of citizens with past criminal convictions. As you know, last November, Floridians overwhelmingly voted to throw out the state's shameful felony disenfranchisement law and restore rights to people who have completed their sentences. This was expected to help 1.4 million Floridians to regain voting rights. But under the new bill, citizens will have to pay back all fees and fines resulting from their convictions before they are eligible to vote. Most, if not many, or if not most of these citizens will not be able to do that. The Florida Court Clerks Association has said that for 83% of court fines, there is only a minimal expectation of payment, 83%. If signed, this legislation will be a major blow not only to the biggest voting rights expansion in half a century, but also to the African American community in Florida, which is dramatically overrepresented among those disenfranchised. Third, as you can tell, these measures are not race neutral. They disproportionately harm African American voters and other voters of color. Race is also a significant factor driving these efforts to cut back on voting, and studies prove that. States where the political clout of African Americans and other minorities is growing, and states that used to be covered under the Voting Rights Act, are far more likely than other states to introduce and to pass measures to cut back on voting access. And as you heard, over the past couple of years, there has been a remarkable and unusual spate of court rulings finding that states and localities have purposefully discriminated in their voting laws. It is not accidental. The scope and sophistication of efforts to make voting more difficult make clear that a strong defense is essential, but not enough. And that brings me to my last point, and a happier one. At the same time as these vote suppression efforts are moving, we are also seeing significant momentum around the country around efforts to bolster protections for voting rights and expand access to the ballot. Last November, Americans passed, with overwhelming bipartisan majorities, a record number of state ballot initiatives to improve democracy, including 4 to increase voting access. Now, we are seeing a striking number of states pushing legislative packages with multiple pro-voter reforms in them. So far this year, we've seen reforms like early voting and same-day registration pass in New York, Virginia, Delaware, and New Mexico. We see nationwide momentum in favor of restoring rights for people with past convictions, Florida notwithstanding, with bills actively moving in 5 states and passing one house in Colorado with bipartisan support. And there is strong momentum for automatic voter registration, which has been introduced and passed in 15 states and DC over the past 4 years. And our recent study shows that automatic voter registration has dramatically increased registration rates everywhere it has been adopted, from 16% in Oregon all the way up to 94% in Georgia. This could add 50 million voters to the rolls and transform our elections. Overall, good bills are outpacing bad ones. This session, we've actually seen momentum in 35 states around bills to expand voting access, and only 10 states on bills to restrict voting access. This momentum has reached as far as our nation's capital. Last month, the House of Representatives passed H.R. 1, a historic bill with the key reforms needed to revitalize American democracy, including a broad pro-voter package and a commitment to restoring the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. The House continues to hold hearings on voting rights and is building a record for the Voting Rights Act. This could be a turning point with your help. No effort is more critical, and I want to thank the National Urban League for all that you're doing to lift this effort up. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and I want to thank Wendy and Urban Leaguers. We cannot stand on the side in our states and locales and watch the right to vote eroded. This is an area where our voices, the voices of our local CEOs, the voices of our volunteers have to be front and center. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of mission. This is an issue of morality. This is an issue of what kind of nation we want to live in. Do we want to live in a nation where people have the right to elect their representatives and their leaders? Or do we want to live in an oligarchy or a plutocracy where only a handful of people call the shots? We must lead on this issue. We must be active in the state legislatures, in opposition to suppression, and in favor of voter expansion. It is our calling, it is our cause, it is our duty. Let's give the Brennan Center another big round of applause. Thank you for an excellent report. Here to discuss ways that Russian trolls exploited racism to distort our democracy is Laura Rosenberger, a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, our other partner in this report. She is also the director of the fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy. Please welcome Laura.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to apologize for the slightly scratchy voice and the occasional cough. I've come down with a bit of a cold, but didn't want to miss the opportunity to join you all this morning. First of all, I'm just really pleased to be here with the National Urban League for this really important day, and I really want to thank Mark for his vision and leadership in wanting to include this really important issue in this year's report. I think, as Mark mentioned, my view is very similar. We've heard a lot of discussion about Russian interference in our democracy in the 2016 election. There's been a lot of discussion about the Mueller report, but one of the things that concerns me that I think has been severely under-discussed is the way in which the Russian Federation not only used social media as a weapon, but used race as a weapon to divide polarize Americans, and suppress the black vote in 2016. And I worry that without significant change between now and 2020 from our elected leadership and the social media companies, we may see the same thing in 2020. So I want to underscore the urgency of this as I begin to give an overview. Now, Mark gave a really good introduction to my talk that was essentially, could have given a lot of what I was going to talk about. So let me just springboard off of a couple of those things. One is, I think that we think about Russia's interference as an election issue by and large. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that while, I'm quoting one of my colleagues here, she has a really nice phrase, elections are not a starting point or an ending point for Russia's operations, they are a flashpoint. They provide a moment in time to take particular advantage of vulnerabilities in our democracy and a particularly focused electorate, but it is not the beginning and end. In fact, we know that the Russian efforts to target the 2016 election began in 2014. And what I can tell you is that they actually increased in the aftermath of the 2016 election. We saw significant mobilization on social media after the 2016 election. And of course, we saw ongoing activity in the run-up to the 2018 midterms. In the run-up to 2016, for instance, only 11% of the total content that Russian trolls pushed online was related to the election, though that produced a disproportionate level of engagement. So they were actually able to get more people to engage on that content. One of the things that we know, according to the Department of Justice, that was a goal of the IRA was to, quote, build political intensity through supporting radical groups, users dissatisfied with the social and economic situation, and oppositional social movements. They were particularly effective at trying to use divisive issues in our politics. So things like police shootings of African Americans were something that we saw seized on by Russian internet trolls as a particularly divisive moment in our politics. But even since 2016, one of the things we've seen them leap onto was, believe it or not, the take a knee debate around the NFL and whether or not African American players should be able to kneel in protest. And in fact, in that instance, we saw them jump on both sides of the political debate. So they were actually playing both sides of that. So let me just walk you through a couple of the particular ways that we have seen the Russian social media efforts and other efforts targeting our democracy exploit race as a weapon of their attacks on us. The first is they use, Mark talked about my favorite Russian internet troll, woke Louisa Haynes. She was not only, by the way, a prominent purveyor of content on social media, you would, if you go and look online, you would find that she was quoted in numerous newspapers as an African-American activist from New York who was particularly active on these issues and was particularly skeptical of Hillary Clinton. So her voice was lifted up seemingly as a genuine activist in media beyond just the social media. They also formed fake groups, fake Black Lives Matter groups, groups that appeared to be mobilizing on the same issues as many real Black Lives Matter activists. These groups not only gained followers online, but actually were used by the IRA in some cases to mobilize protests and rallies in real life. So you have activists showing up to protests that they believe are being organized by fellow activists, but are actually being organized by Russian internet trolls sitting in St. Petersburg who don't give a bleep about the issue of police shootings of unarmed African Americans. What they care about is trying to divide Americans. And what they were doing was seizing on a popular, a highly discussed issue online in order to gain followers. So once they would gain those followers through these prominent activist accounts or these groups, what they would do then is inject other kinds of content. So the kinds of voter suppression you saw that Mark showed on the slides was possible because they had spent all of this time developing communities of people who thought that they were engaging with like-minded folks, and therefore were more likely to think it was credible and more likely to agree with it. So you saw saw content, as you know, that was saying vote online, but you also saw things like, you know, Hillary Clinton has a terrible record on criminal justice, so you shouldn't vote, or not voting is just as much of a vote as voting, or you should vote for Jill Stein because she's better for the black community. All these kinds of narratives that were essentially voter suppression, voter misdirection, seemingly by by accounts that people thought were fellow Americans, but were not. Another thing that we saw, I mentioned briefly, was that the seizing on both sides of the debate. And there's some really fascinating research, in particular on the Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter conversations online, where a researcher found that the clusters of the IRA accounts in those conversations, the Russian troll accounts, were the most polarizing, most divisive, most extreme in those conversations. So they were taking legitimate conversation amongst Americans and trying to pull it further to the extremes, using our real wound of racism as an opportunity to further polarize, further divide us, and manipulate our democracy. We also see them on the other side of the debate, helping to stoke the racist, toxic vitriol that's often directed at black activists. And one thing that I am quite worried about goes beyond just the social media piece, and it is in the 2016 election, you may have seen that Russian hackers were also able to probe or gain access to at least 21 states' election systems, so some part of their election systems. In some cases, that included the voter rolls. And one of the things that many of us are deeply concerned about is not just the ability to get into the election systems, but to potentially manipulate the voter rolls so that you could potentially try to suppress a certain element of the electorate. So this is something that I think people should be particularly concerned about. A last word about the dynamics that I'm really worried about with this kind of activity. Mark talked very eloquently about the voter suppression aspects. I'm also very worried beyond that about how I see essentially legitimate activists and legitimate activist movements being hijacked. These are movements that are being undermined and delegitimized by an adversary of the United States. And it's not only having an effect on the activists' ability to exercise their free speech, but potentially when we see these fake rallies being organized, it undermines free assembly. And so for me, this goes very profoundly to the very foundations of our democracy and the ability of Americans not only to exercise their right to vote, but to speech and to assembly. So I hope all of you will use the opportunity to shed some additional light on this issue and raise your concerns about it. Thank you so much for your time today.
Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that, like me, you are stunned by the magnitude and the breadth and the potential success of these activities. I know that when I first met with the German Marshall Fund and learned about the depth and the magnitude of this, it was something that the National Urban League had to include, not only in its report, but that we needed to call on everyone to focus on this element of foreign interference. This element of foreign interference, stoking America's racial divisions, suppressing the African American vote, was central to the intentions of Vladimir Putin. And I want you to join me today and say, Mr. Putin, hands off American democracy. Mr. Putin, you will not suppress our vote ever again. We have to be vigilant and we have to be diligent. And our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies and people at the highest levels have to take whatever steps are necessary. The social media companies have to take whatever steps are necessary to shut this down, to shut this down. Today, they can take the identity of a Black Lives Matter activist. Tomorrow, they will take the identity of an Urban League local CEO. And the following day, they'll take the identity of an elected political leader. There's no bounds to this kind of nefarious, this kind of diabolical, this sort of hateful, pernicious, and I'll admit clever actions by the Russian Federation. So we're going to have a discussion about this right now, and I am so excited that to lead this panel is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a member of the Washington Post editorial board, a good friend of the National Urban League, Jonathan Capehart. Welcome, Jonathan. I think it's all yours, and I'll come back at the end. Good, thank you.
Oh, I thought Mark was going to introduce the other panelists. Mark, thank you very... No, I'll do it. That's okay. That was my fault, not yours, Mr. President. Thank you very much, President Morial, for asking me to do this. Thank you very much to the National Urban League for every year putting a spotlight on the state of Black America. And it's particularly important this year to focus on the vote. And I think President Morial put it right when he issued that call to Russian President Vladimir Putin to keep your hands off our American democracy. And so to help talk about this and what is happening, I think we know what's happening at a 40,000-foot level, but to talk to people who are reporting on this in real time on the ground, I want to call up Deborah Barfield-Berry. She is a reporter based here in Washington correspondent for USA Today. And Kira Lerner, reporter with The Appeal. So I think you both heard, I believe it was President Morial, who rightly said that the right to vote and voting rights are not a partisan issue. And as straight news reporters, for you, this issue is not a matter of advocacy or taking one side or another. This is pointing out what is happening. I would love for each of you to take a moment to talk about what you have learned through your reporting about what is happening or what is not happening when it comes to suppressing the vote. Let's start with you, Kira.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. By way of background, I've been covering voter suppression and voting rights since the 2014 election. So I've been watching it closely, 2014, 2016, the 2018 midterms. I think everything we've heard today is very spot on. I've been on the ground in states across the country, across the South, seeing these things happen firsthand. It's also not in the South. I've spent time reporting on Native American reservations in South Dakota and Nevada, where we see these issues of voter suppression on a wide scale. But something that I think is important to keep in mind about what's happening in the South, Mark spoke about the terrible trio, and we do see these three actors that are playing a huge role in voter suppression. But this is happening all across the country at jurisdictions large and small on the county level. By way of example, I was in Georgia ahead of the 2018 election, and I was riding on a bus with a group called Black Voters Matter, a group started by Cliff Albright and Latasha Brown down in Georgia. We were driving across the state. We were helping people get out to vote, doing voter education. I happened to be on the bus reporting about them as they went across Georgia. We were in a rural county. We were in Jefferson County, majority African American part of Georgia. They loaded up 40 senior citizens, African American senior citizens, on the bus, and they were about to take them to go vote. They were dancing in the street and preparing to go vote. And the county administrator called and told them that they couldn't bring these group of senior citizens to the polls because they called it political activity. There was no actual law preventing this type of thing. So I just think it's important to keep in note that voter intimidation is part of this as well, and we see things that aren't rising to the level of statewide legislation or things that would never make it to the Supreme Court. But this is happening everywhere at jurisdictions across the country.
I too have been covering voting rights and civil rights for a long time, several elections. And what amazes me about covering it is I'm still covering it. That, you know, it might have been a little different earlier, but each election, there's still something else to write about. And I sometimes, we talked about sometimes the perception whether people think that there's still voter suppression. I think sometimes explaining as a reporter that what people thought of the image of voter suppression, the poll taxes, counting the, you know, the bubbles.
Bubbles
all
in the
that,
bar of
right,
soap.
bar of soap, is the image they have of what voter suppression looks like. But voter suppression doesn't necessarily look like that anymore. And sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not so subtle. So sometimes I think part of what we do as journalists, or try to do as journalists, is not just say it's voter suppression, because that's the language that civil rights leaders use or voting rights leaders use, is that we have to go further to try to explain, so what does that look like? You know, is it Ms. Smith who can't get her voter ID because she's in a rural county in Alabama, and why she can't get it? Or she can't get from that side of the county to the other side of the county to vote because they closed the voting polls. So I think sometimes we just have to go a little further in trying to explain just what it looks like. And then, because I'm in Washington, I cover Congress. I cover a lot of what Congress does or doesn't do when it relates to voting rights. And that, too, has not changed much in the years that I've been covering it. I mean, here we are now talking about having Marcia Fudge having field hearings about voter election issues for 2020. You know, and I've sat there on the steps of the Capitol when they reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. And for the most part, I think a lot of those lawmakers thought we were good to go.
What year was that? When
2006.
Right, that was when President Bush was in office, and it
Yes.
passed the Senate, but it was like 98-0.
It was overwhelmingly.
And then the Supreme Court steps in,
Right.
And basically guts the primary provision of the Voting Rights Act. There had been calls consistently, well, at least in the last couple of years of President Bush and throughout the 2 terms of President Obama, to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and yet nothing's happened, Barbara. I mean, Deborah, why hasn't anything happened? That's called a leading question.
I know. Depends on who you talk to. And that's been, obviously, it's been a push for years since then. Democrats will argue that Republicans are resistant to reauthorizing. Oh, I'm sorry, you weren't asking about reauthorizing. You're asking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It has been reauthorized.
Okay.
It has been.
But I'm talking about because the Supreme Court,
Right,
when
right,
it
right,
made
right.
its decision,
Right,
it said, well, Congress can go and fix these issues, and Congress has been called on to do this, but it hasn't.
Right. So that said, especially when it happened, it was a Republican-controlled body, both chambers. That has since changed. So now there's a real aggressive push by the House side, which is led by Democrats, to come up with evidence. So they're having hearings. Marcia Fudge is leading some hearings out in the states. They're doing hearings here in Congress. But the part of the challenge will be, and already is, whether they get Republican support to do that.
And so far?
So far, there has not been a whole lot of folks who signed on to either H.R. 1 or some of the bills that have come out of H.R. 1.
Or even any interest, it would seem.
Well,
no? From the Republican
there are
side.
a couple of lawmakers who have voiced some interest or have come to the hearings, including Rodney Davis, who is the ranking member. So he's attended the hearings. He's attended the hearings.
He's attended the hearings. Kara, I'm sorry. Do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think the issue of voting has become, I mean, Deborah can talk to this maybe better because she's been covering this for longer, but since I've started covering voting, I think it's become partisan to a degree that it may not have been in the past. And I think we see Republicans and Democrats divided on basic things like automatic voter registration and early voting and things that in the past were not considered partisan issues and things that everyone could get behind and believe that extending democracy to more people was a good thing to do. And so I do think we see lawmakers both here in DC and Congress and in state legislatures across the country being pretty divided along partisan lines.
One of the things that I believe it was Wendy Weiser, she made a point of saying that the efforts to suppress the vote around the country are very focused racially. You just talked about the incident in Georgia, which got a lot of national press, where there were cameras there, so we actually got to see LaTosha Brown stand there and be very, very defiant about, no, we are going to go vote. But from both of your reporting, does your reporting match what Wendy is saying? And is it more pervasive and more severe than what she had to say?
Well, Wendy is definitely the expert, so she knows well. I think from my reporting and from my colleagues, especially in our USA Today network, which is a whole bunch of papers, yeah, it's definitely happening. It's definitely happening a lot of on the state level. Like again, I cover Congress, but a lot, of course, what bubbles up comes from the states, and I think we can definitely say that we can't use the word voter suppression because that's not how we are supposed to characterize it. But there are a lot of efforts in the states to pull back
to prevent people from voting.
Access to, right.
The access to the ballot.
Yeah, it's definitely happened.
And I just want to point out, if you hear sort of the hesitation in Deborah's voice, it's not that she is unaware of what's going on. She is very much, unlike me, I'm an opinion writer. Deborah is a news side reporter. And the uncomfortable, I mean, you can see that she's uncomfortable even in using the language. Right. And that should let everyone know that people who are news side reporters take their roles as being objective arbiters of what they're reporting very, very seriously. So when you have a reporter like Deborah here and Kira here telling you, this is what I've seen on the ground, this is what my reporting tells me, you must take it seriously. You should take it seriously. Now, that being said, one of the more alarming things we've seen come out of all of the reporting that's been done in terms of Russian interference in the election, and what I believe it was I'm sorry, the last person who spoke, Laura, brought up the fact that, they were flooding Facebook and Instagram and Twitter with fake accounts and fake stories that people who then ended up being quoted in legitimate establishment media entities. Yeah. How will you, going forward, prevent yourself, or let's broaden it out, how should journalists prevent themselves or guard against themselves becoming unwitting agents of a hostile foreign power?
It's definitely a good question. I think it's something that journalists across the country are battling with right now. I think it comes down to basic news values and vetting everything that comes across your screen or comes to you through an interview. I think reporters have to do their due diligence and figure out where sources are getting their information and where these things are coming from. But yeah, I think one of the other issues that's happening right now when social media is so prevalent is that a lot of voters are getting this information without reporters as the middleman. They can go onto Facebook and they can see Twitter or a number of sources and see this information firsthand. And if it's not vetted by a credible news source, it's hard for a regular voter to know whether or not to take it seriously. So I think voters also have to do their due diligence and make sure they're reading credible news outlets and getting the right information, because otherwise there'll just be a flood of misinformation. I hate to use the term fake news because this isn't even news. These are foreign actors pretending to be news. But I think it really takes like a level of news intelligence and awareness.
And we have a very rigorous process to figuring out who we're talking to, especially via email, because you can get emails from anybody,
right.
and especially you get a lot of emails from lawmakers and their person said. So we always have to check. Number one, is it coming from a reliable source? Or two, once you check that, maybe even call just to make sure. A lot of the
What, call? What do you mean, call? In the
yeah, we need to back
That
up.
old-fashioned way?
Old-fashioned, just to make sure I'm talking to who I think I'm talking to, and verify that it's coming from that particular source. A lot of people in the movement or in the civil rights arena I know already, so when their stuff comes through or their calls come through, I know it's reliable and trustworthy and can use it. But yeah, we're very careful too.
You know, as a point of personal privilege, so this is one of my hobby horses, to pick up on what Kira was talking about in terms of news consumers, you know, spreading misinformation or outright falsehoods. And, you know, especially on Twitter, people they will see a tweet, and there might be a link attached, but they don't even bother to click the link. They just send it, they retweet it, they post it, they talk about it. And one of the things I urge people to do is, if you see a tweet and there's a link, click the link before you tweet. Once you click the link, read what's there. If you follow me on Twitter, you know one of my favorite things to say to somebody question is, you didn't read the piece, did you?
And journalists know if that's happening because we get data about how many retweets and shares there are and how many people are actually looking at the article.
Right, yeah, we know how long you spend on our sites.
Exactly.
But the point is, there are a lot of passionate people out there. They want to argue and they want to talk about these issues, but they're only doing it with half or a quarter or maybe even an eighth of the information that they need. And so in order to guard against, again, being manipulated by a hostile foreign power, make sure that you are reading the things that you are retweeting and clicking the hyperlinks within those stories that you're reading, because if the journalists put a hyperlink in there, if Kira's puts a hyperlink in her story, or if Deborah's put a hyperlink in her story, it's there for a reason. It's there for you to click and to read and to further educate yourself. Kira, in going forward, what are you looking at in terms of efforts to block the vote going forward?
Yeah, there's a lot of things happening right now. We've heard already today about what's going on the ground in Florida when it comes to Amendment 4, which was the Voting Rights Restoration Amendment passed by an overwhelming majority of Floridians on the November ballot. And we saw the legislature last week pass an effort that advocates call a modern-day poll tax. Deborah talked about how we're seeing new efforts to suppress voters. We're also seeing some old efforts come back. And people in Florida say, we've been through this before, we know what poll taxes look like, and this is effectively a poll tax. The governor still hasn't signed it, but it's likely that he will. And there's been a number of civil rights groups and activists who have vowed to bring litigation if it does become law. So I'm keeping a close eye on what's happening in Florida. We're also seeing a number of efforts across the country to criminalize voting and to basically increase penalties if people were to make mistakes or make errors when they're casting a ballot. I'm watching a bill in Texas that would change, if you make an error on a voter registration application, right now that's a misdemeanor. They want to change it to a felony that could be punishable by up to 2 years in prison. Some of you might remember Crystal Mason. She was a woman in Texas who was prosecuted for illegal voting. She had a criminal conviction, and she's currently serving a 5-year sentence. And so people like her would become more common. We're seeing a similar thing in Tennessee. So this is going on all across the country, and some of this legislation only gets attention during election years and when an election is coming up. So I think it's really great that everyone here is paying attention to this in an off year.
And from as a Washington reporter, I am also going to follow the legislation, or what does or doesn't happen with the legislation here. Also trying to go out to one of the field hearings that Marsha Fudge is having. She's I think she has 2 more states left, including Alabama, so it will be interesting to be on the ground in Alabama. And as a network, USA Today, or Gannett, has about 100 newspapers, and one of the things we're doing is we set up a voting rights team. And as a team, as part of 2020 coverage, we're going to be doing stuff from the ground, our papers on the ground, and doing pieces going forward about what is or isn't happening as it relates to voting rights and voters. voter suppression. Voter
Well,
suppression.
Deborah, you've mentioned several times now Congresswoman Fudge's town halls around the country.
Hearings.
Hearings. Have you gone to one or two?
No, I haven't gone, but because we have papers in some of the places where she held the hearings, some of my colleagues have gone there, and/or I'm trying to go, so this might be my pitch right here, to go to some of them, but we have some people on the ground, so sometimes we spread out and use our resources differently.
And can you, well, given that the papers in the USA Today network have covered those hearings, do you know, or can you talk about what's been revealed in those hearings?
Much of it has been kind of what has already been raised as concerns, whether they're early voting and the changes that are happening more locally. So they kind of shed light on what the legislature has done in those states to
Suppress the vote. I'll say it for you.
the challenges or roadblocks that people perceive are roadblocks in those states. So it's kind of been that. When I interviewed her maybe a month ago, and what her goal is to do all these field hearings in these key states, places where voter suppression was an issue or raised as an issue. And then by June was her deadline to get all this together, to do a hearing here, and then by June or fall to have this report, and then to use that as kind of leverage to move some legislation forward to address that. So let's go.
And you said at the beginning of this conversation that the thing that surprises you the most about covering efforts to keep people from voting is that you're still reporting on efforts to keep people from voting. You just mentioned that you interviewed Congresswoman Fudge about a month ago.
Earlier.
Did she express to you a similar amazement that she, as a member of Congress in 2019, having to go around the country to talk to people about the right to vote, or more specifically, about efforts to keep people from exercising their right to vote?
I don't know if she called it surprise. Congresswoman Fudge is angry. She's passionate about it. She's angry about it. She's on a mission, and she says as much, that she's on a mission that this should not be happening now, and that we're going to do something about it. So I don't know if surprise is the right word, because many members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Tri-Caucus, all of them have made this a priority. Not that it hasn't been in the past, but now that they have more power, in the House in particular, they've made it their call to handle that this year, or address that this year.
You know, one of the things at the beginning of President Trump's term that he did was to set up his quote-unquote voter fraud commission.
Advisory commission.
Yes, that sort of went down in a ball of flames because even Republican governors would not cooperate with what the commission was doing. Do you think that effort, the president's effort to establish this commission and then its very public immolation, changed the perception among the American people about whether voter fraud was a reality or an issue that they should even care about, or that is even a real issue?
I mean, unfortunately, the existence of this panel in the first place kind of spread this rhetoric and this myth of voter fraud, and the fact that the panel was disbanded didn't have the same type of effect on the American public as seeing the president and members and his allies and election officials who joined the panel from across the country talk about this myth of voter fraud. I think it was really dangerous, and I think it empowered a lot of Republican lawmakers across the country to carry that myth and to push for legislation like the bill I was talking about in Texas or in Tennessee or in Florida. It really gave a platform to some of these myths, and we all know that they found no credible evidence of illegal voters. Chris Kobach, who I've been covering for a long time and who is the co-chair of this commission, he has failed time and time again to prove his theory that non-citizens are voting and that there's illegal voting going on across the country. A federal judge in Kansas basically ruled that he had to take like legal remediation classes and that he had like totally messed up his arguments in front of the court and he had no evidence. And so the law in Kansas that was being litigated was struck down. But I think, unfortunately, some of that That ruling didn't get as much attention as President Trump standing in front of a large rally and talking about illegal voters. And so I think this myth continues.
And I think, too, that some of the people who already were on his side on that issue pretty much were still on his side even after the issue, and others on the other side. But I think one of the things that even some Republican lawmakers and election officials in particular agree with Democrats on, they're concerned about the administration and others making people feel like their elections are not fair and accurate. It's like when President Trump told Republicans, you should be a little paranoid. Remember that? Not recently? Told Republicans you should be a little paranoid about whether your votes count or whether votes are counted accurately. Both sides, election officials, were alarmed by that. They were worried that it would shake up and rattle voters. And they want voters to believe in the system. They want them to still have faith in the system. And the more you say things like that, the more everybody questions it. And both sides didn't want that.
That's true. There were Republican lawmakers that were kind of trying to distance themselves away from this panel because this panel was even more extreme than they were willing to go.
Right.
Kira, on the ground, back to your point about the myth of voter fraud and people who don't have the right to vote are actually flooding polling places and voting. On the ground, do everyday people really believe that voter fraud is a thing?
That's a good question. It would depend who you talk to. There are definitely people who hear Trump's rhetoric and who believe that there are non-citizen voters coming to their polling places. They can't point to any evidence of it, but there's people who buy into that myth. But for the most part, most people I talk to on the ground, especially going across the South and covering these last few elections, they're way more impacted by changes to voting laws that are happening. And they know that when they go to the polling place and are asked for a voter ID and they don't have the appropriate form, they know that these problems are way more prevalent than people flooding across the border to influence our elections.
If I could add to that too,
Yeah.
A colleague and I wrote a story last year. UVA had done a poll kind of questioning people and whether they trusted the election system. And they were surprised and alarmed that only half of them kind of believed that the systems were fair. And they were disillusioned by that, or disappointed by that. But part of what we did was we called voters or people who were part of the poll. And some of the people we talked to were like, no, we trust our system. But what they said was, we trust them, but we don't trust you.
Yeah. You,
we don't
meaning
trust
the press.
The press, the media.
Sorry.
They don't trust the media covering elections. So it's like, okay, it's not even that. They don't trust what we write about elections. So it's like, oh, that's even more disillusioned.
At the risk of going down this rabbit hole a little further, but that is an interesting point to make. It's that they have confidence in the electoral system, but they don't have confidence in us. And is that a result of sort of long-standing mistrust of the press that was taken advantage of by the president during the campaign and while in office, where he goes to rallies and calls members of the press, calls us enemies of the people, says that what we do is fake news, says, calls us names and says that whatever we do can't be trusted. Is that what's feeding the mistrust in us? In us rather than a mistrust in the electoral system?
I think so. I think it's a big part of people not trust. I mean, you either, some people didn't trust the media before that anyway,
Right.
But I think it definitely plays a role in that, especially even when I've gone out and done stories, people say, well, you're fake news. I mean, where did it come from? You don't even know me or my body of work. Yeah, I'm part of fake news. So yeah, it absolutely plays a role.
And
oh, absolutely.
For an example, I was in Alabama covering the special election in 2017. So I think this was a good example because it was a year after the 2016 election. We heard all of Trump's rhetoric about fake news. And I was at rallies across the state for both Roy Moore and Doug Jones. And at some of the Roy Moore rallies, I would talk to voters and I would ask them about the allegations against their candidate, all of the reporting by the Washington Post about his sexual assault of minors. And they would say, that's the Washington Post, that's fake news, we don't believe that. So they're working with a whole different set of facts and information when they're going to vote. And I think we actually saw that for a majority of Alabama voters didn't hold that opinion, which is why we now have Senator Doug Jones. But it was pretty shocking to see that the report wasn't even believed in the first place.
I was in Alabama too. I was with Roy Moore, not with him, but on the night of election, I was clarification. I was covering Roy Moore, so I was at his campaign headquarters the night of the.
I was at Doug Jones.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I had to, of course, go talk to people there, but of course they were his people because they were at the rally. But they were vicious.
Yeah.
I'm kind of nice. So I was approachable and approached them and told them that I was there, but they were definitely on the attack, especially the Washington Post and the media. But they wanted to talk because they wanted to make sure Roy, they know that we wrote that Roy Moore or whatever, they supported him. But it was not pretty.
Yeah, but meanwhile, the energy at the Doug Jones party where I was that night was like almost nothing I'd ever experienced on election day before. There were so many new voters, first-time voters. I spent the day taking videos and posting them on social media. One woman who cried when she cast her first ballot ever for Doug Jones. That video went viral because it really spoke to a lot of people. So I think there were a lot of things going on in Alabama that night.
And that actually is a nice segue to what I wanted to ask about the reaction to these efforts to keep people from voting. What are organizations doing to ensure that whatever is done at the state and local level is met with an equal response to ensure that people who find themselves suddenly ineligible to vote have the wherewithal to make sure that they do have the right to vote the next time they go to the ballot box?
This is not just that local, but one of the first things I remember when President Trump set up his commission, one of the first things, I don't know if it was days later or a week later, the DNC came up with, bam, we have a counter commission. I mean, he didn't even have a time to get started before Terry Sewell was vice chairing some committee to counter everything he said and did. So that was on kind of this level. But then on the ground, I think there are a whole lot of groups, whether it's Melanie Campbell's groups or Tasha's groups, and all these groups that are already on the ground, starting way before 2020, to work on these counter efforts. They're doing the GOTV stuff, they're doing the awareness stuff, the education stuff. So these are not new. I mean, these groups have been doing these things for years, but it seems to be, number one, more media attention to them, and it's more ramped up because they know the importance of getting ready for 2020. So they're all on the ground.
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on so many of these groups. There's like an endless list of acronyms I could go through of groups that are on the ground doing this important work when a lot of times the media is not paying attention because it's not an election year. I'm trying to change that and make sure that we do know what's happening. One particular group I would call out is the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition in Florida that did amazing work to get Amendment 4 on the ballot and then passed, and they're not giving up the fight as we see this legislation that would require the payment of fines and fees as we see that move through the legislature. And I think that's a model of really how a grassroots movement can have massive success, and other states are taking note and are similarly looking at efforts to overturn their felon disenfranchisement laws. Iowa, Virginia, and Kentucky still have some of the strictest felon disenfranchisement laws in the country, and we're seeing movements to overturn those. We're also seeing movements to allow people to vote while incarcerated. Bernie Sanders has made that a big topic recently, and we're seeing more and more people back that effort. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to read both local and national news to see what these groups are up to and to see what kind of impact they'll have on 2020.
And Keurig, my last question for you, I've got a last question for you, Deborah. The lawsuits that are out there across the country trying to stop some of these efforts, can you give a quick update on where one or two might be that might come to mind?
Yeah, I mean, they're having mixed results. We saw the Supreme Court, believe it was last year or the year before, uphold Ohio's voter purge effort, and now we're seeing other states understanding that they also can purge voters who haven't voted in past elections. But we are seeing successes in some places. In Florida, a federal court initially ruled that the state's felon disenfranchisement law was unconstitutional. Then we saw an appeals court reverse that, and then the whole thing was put on hold because of the ballot initiative. Yeah, I mean, I think as we see more laws take effect, like the one in Texas I've been talking about that'll criminalize voters, we will see more litigation, and I will be tracking it.
And Deborah, during, I think it was an interview with Time Magazine during the Time 100 last week or a couple weeks ago. Time moves so quickly in our new reality. Jared Kushner, who is the president's son-in-law, but also a senior advisor to the president, he characterized foreign interference in the election as, quote, a few Facebook ads. As someone who covers Congress and has walked the halls of Congress, can you give us any idea as to how that comment landed among members of Congress who, and mind you, of course, he said this after the release of the Mueller report, where the volume 1 was all about, in intricate detail, how the Russians interfered in the 2016 election. How did we know how members of Congress feel about the Mueller report. Right. How did they feel about what a senior advisor to the president, who's the son-in-law, had to say about Russian interference?
Now, I did not cover that, so.
Okay.
And I can't speak to their direct response to that. So, but to say, I have covered enough of cybersecurity concerns, particularly as it relates to elections. And many of the members on both sides, and I've interviewed several, no one seems to disagree about Russian interference. No one seems to disagree about meddling, if you will, in elections. Now, they may disagree about how to address it or whether to address it, especially as it relates to elections. But they all seem to feel like, yes, Russia's interfered. Yes, we need to be on top of it. Both sides agreed last year to set aside $380 million to help state election officials address election concerns, particularly cybersecurity. So they have invested money in it and talked about it, but I can't speak to that specific one. But yeah, I don't think anybody's saying that they're not getting in the mix of our election process.
All right. Deborah Barfield-Berry of the USA Today, Kira Lerner of The Appeal. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.
Please welcome back to the stage, Mark H. Morial.
Excellent job. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Let's give our panelists another big round of applause. Before we adjourn, this discussion is going to continue tomorrow at the opening plenary of our Legislative Policy Conference. The session, State of Black America, Race, Lies, and Voter Suppression, kicks off at 9 a.m. with a dynamic panel of speakers over at the Hyatt Regency Capitol Hill, and an opportunity for all of us to engage in a discussion, ask questions, participate, and interact on the subject matter covered in the State of Black America report. So we encourage you absolutely to be there. Before we close, the National Urban League is diagnostic and prescriptive. We never simply call out problems. We never simply point to the challenges. We want to be proactive with recommendations, with potential solutions. So here are some of the recommendations of the 2019 State of Black America report. Some of it is legislation already pending in Congress. H.R. 1, we must pass H.R. 1, which includes a wide range of voting reforms like enhanced cyber security protection of election systems, removing barriers to voter registration, and prohibiting the distribution of false information about elections to either hinder or discourage voting. We also endorse H.R. 4, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore the full enforcement protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We also make some bold suggestions, like it is time to eliminate the Electoral College. The Electoral College is anachronistic and it's inconsistent with our system of democracy. We are making an effort and will make an effort, and we encourage you to take our text today, which will send messages to Congress to pass the Voting Rights Advancement Act. This important civil rights legislation would ensure that fair access to the ballot for all Americans is protected. You can help by contacting your representative. Text VRA4 to the number 53886. Use your phones. That's VRA4 to the number 53886 and a message. Ooh, Lord, it's 52. What's teleprompter wrong? 52886. I stand corrected. 52886. Let's take action now. This technology will send a message to your member of Congress right away. To access the State of Black America's complete suite of recommendations, offerings, essays, data, and expert analysis, and a ready-for-download version of the report's executive summary, please head to the website, www.stateofblackamerica.org. Today begins the beginning of our annual Legislative Policy Conference, and I want to thank all of you for traveling here, for being with us today. I want to close by saying this. We took a different approach with the State of Black America this year because this threat to our right to vote is a clear and present danger to everything that the National Urban League has stood for over 100 years. This threat to our democracy is a threat to everything that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was all about. We are called to step up, we're called to stand up, and we're called to speak up. And that is what we will do from this day forward. So thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you. To all of those who followed us on Facebook Live or on C-SPAN or on NBC.org or anywhere online, we want to thank you for being a part of this. And let's continue the conversation in social media. God bless you, and thank you for being with us this morning.